The memory is etched into my soul, a perfect, horrifying tableau. On that fateful day, I took the first bus heading to Chicago, a journey into the heart of a nightmare I didn't yet understand. During the 3-hour ride, I didn't say a single word. My eyes were glued to the window, watching the bleak autumn landscape blur past a mirror of the confusion in my own mind. My heart was tied in a knot so tight I could barely breathe. I told myself over and over to calm down, that there was a simple explanation, but my hands trembled as I clutched the paper ticket, a flimsy shield against a rising tide of dread. When I finally got off at the main terminal, the city was already surrendering to the encroaching darkness of evening. I walked quickly, my pace urgent, toward the gated community where my son Daniel lived. I walked down the same familiar path I had walked dozens of times to visit him and Matthew, my precious grandson. But this time, every step felt heavy, each footfall, a leaden weight as if I were wading through an unseen current, pulling me deeper into a nightmare. Standing in front of the familiar dark wooden door, I knocked, first gently, then with more and more force, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet street. "Daniel Matthew," I shouted, but my voice broke in the cold, indifferent air. No one answered. In a moment of desperation, I put my hand on the doorknob just to try my luck. But when I turned it slightly, the door creaked open with a low, mournful groan. It was unlocked. My heart, which had been a frantic drum, started pounding at 1,000 miles an hour. Daniel never left the door unlocked. He was always so careful, so meticulously protective, especially when Matthew was home. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding my breath, my entire body tense as if the slightest noise could shatter the fragile hope I was clinging to into a million pieces. Inside the scene I saw left me frozen, a statue carved from fear. The living room was a chaotic mess, a silent testament to a violent struggle. The sofa was pushed far out of place as if someone had shoved it in a blind rage. On the floor, a coffee mug lay shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, the white porcelain shards mixed with a dark, dried coffee stain that looked like old blood. I stepped over it, my legs trembling so badly I thought they would give out, trying not to step on the sharp, glittering glass. In the kitchen, I saw the large water cooler jug tipped on its side, its contents pooled on the floor. Several empty water bottles were rolling on the tiles uncapped, as if someone had chugged them down in a desperate, frantic thirst. The cloying smell of dampness and the oppressive, unnatural silence of the house sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I went upstairs, each step a monumental effort, feeling like I was dragging a heavy stone with every move. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it pounding in my ears, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I pushed open the door to Daniel's home office, empty. His bedroom was empty, too. The bed was still neatly made, but there was no sign of life, no hint of the vibrant man who inhabited this space. Finally, with a sense of mounting dread, I reached Matthew's room. "Matthew, where are you, sweetie?" I called out, my voice hoarse, a ragged whisper. No one answered. I stood in the middle of the room, my eyes scanning his toys, the colorful Lego blocks scattered on the floor, his old beloved teddy bear sitting on his pillow, and I felt like my heart was going to break into a million pieces. Suddenly, a small, almost imperceptible noise came from under the bed, a scraping sound like a plastic bottle rolling on the hardwood floor. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, and a chill, colder than any I had ever known, ran down my entire back. My heart pounded even harder, so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. There was something under the bed. I wanted to bend down to look, to confront whatever was hiding in the shadows, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. I took a stumbling step back, grabbing the edge of a desk with a trembling hand to keep from falling. "Matthew," I called out again, my voice a desperate plea, but only a heavy, suffocating silence answered me, except for that tiny, clear scraping sound, a sound that felt like a sinister warning. Panic, raw and overwhelming, finally took over. I ran out of the house, my hands shaking so badly that I had to dial the police number 3 times to get it right. "My son is missing. I haven't heard from him in 2 weeks." I practically screamed into the phone, my voice cracking with a terror that was all-consuming. "There's a strange noise under my grandson's bed. I stammered, not even sure what I was saying. My words a jumbled mess of fear. I just knew I needed someone to come and fast. In less than 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car painted the windows in a macabre dance. I led the two police officers to Matthew's room, my body trembling, and with a shaky finger I pointed at the bed. Under there, I whispered, not daring to look myself. A young tall officer knelt down, his face serious, and said in a firm, commanding voice, "Is anyone under there?" A heavy silence so thick you could barely breathe filled the room. Then, without another word, the two officers lifted the bed in one single fluid motion. And there, in the dust and shadows, I saw him. It was Matthew, my grandson, curled up in a tight fetal ball. He was so thin, his small body emaciated, his hair matted with sweat, and his clothes were filthy, giving off a sour, heartbreaking smell of neglect. He was clutching an empty water bottle, his knuckles white, his eyes wide open, but completely expressionless, as if he were looking into a world I couldn't reach, a world of unimaginable horror. I stood there paralyzed, feeling my heart stop, my lungs unable to draw breath. The two officers were also in shock, their faces a mixture of pity and disbelief, unable to say a word. I fell to my knees, wanting to hug him, to hold him, but my hands were shaking so much I didn't dare touch him, afraid my own trembling would somehow shatter him further. "Matthew, my boy," I whispered, hot tears finally welling up, blurring my vision. He didn't respond. He just stayed there, a small broken thing, clinging to his empty bottle as if it were the last thing keeping him alive. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew with a chilling certainty that this nightmare was just beginning. My name is Helen. I'm 61 years old, and I live a quiet life alone in a small town not far from a major Midwestern city. My story, this descent into hell, begins one morning in late October when I first realized with a dawning, sickening dread that Daniel was gone. It was 2 eternal, agonizing weeks where I lived with an anxiety so profound it felt like a physical weight, a constant pressure on my chest, an anxiety that had no answers, no relief. The first day, I called Daniel to see how he was, just like I always did. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the morning sun streaming in, phone in hand, listening to it ring over and over, the sound echoing in the silence of my empty house, until it finally went to voicemail. No answer. I sent him a message, a short, simple one. "Are you okay, son?" But the message just sat there, undelivered, a single lonely check mark. I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach, a familiar, unwelcome feeling that something was wrong. But I told myself he was probably just busy, that his battery had died, or that he was somewhere without a signal. Daniel is an independent man, always doing his own thing, so I tried to calm my rising worries. But in the following days, that worry grew like a slow, insidious fire burning inside me, consuming my peace. I called him at the strangest hours, at dawn, when the birds were just beginning to sing, late at night, when the world was quiet, even at noon, when I knew he usually took his lunch break. And always just silence, followed by the cold, impersonal voice of his voicemail. I left him messages, my voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't control. "Daniel, where are you? Call me, please. I'm so worried." But they too were lost in a digital void, with no sign that he had ever heard them. I started to imagine the worst, my mind a torture chamber of horrific possibilities. Daniel wasn't the type to just disappear without saying anything. He always called me every single week, telling me about his job, about Matthew, my precious grandson, about the normal, mundane days of a father and his son. This silence, this complete and utter void, was not like him at all. By the fifth day, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety was eating me alive, a constant gnawing hunger. I tried calling his landline, a desperate hope that I would hear his voice, or at least Matthew's, that bright, cheerful 8-year-old boy who never stopped telling me about school. But I only heard the phone ring and ring in what was clearly an empty house, until I finally hung up the silence on the other end, a confirmation of my deepest fears. I opened up the messaging app the kids use and wrote to Matthew. "Sweetie, where are you?" "Call Grandma." The message sent, but the read receipt never appeared. I felt my heart sink, a physical sensation of dread. Matthew is young, but he knows how to use a phone. and he loves his grandma very much. He always answered as soon as he saw a message from me, his replies filled with emojis and childlike excitement. I started calling Daniel's friends and coworkers, my voice becoming more frantic with each call. They were all surprised, their voices hesitant, filled with a concern that only deepened my own. "I haven't seen Daniel all week," a coworker told me. "I thought he was on vacation." A close friend of his said, "The last time we talked was last month. Daniel told me he was swamped with work." No one knew anything more. The more I asked, the more I felt like I was lost in a void, with no answers, a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. Daniel is not one to disappear without notice. He is a dedicated father, a caring son. Something had to have happened. On the 10th day, I couldn't stand the waiting any longer. I looked up the neighbors who lived near Daniel's house, calling every single person. I had a number for my desperation, growing with each unanswered call. They sighed on the other end of the line, their voices full of a pity that felt like a sharp-pointed stick. An elderly woman who lives across the street from Daniel's house told me that last week on the night of a terrible storm, she saw a light in Daniel's house suddenly turn on and then off. "I thought the boy just turned on the light to go to bed," she said, but her voice trembled as if she too felt that something was deeply wrong. Her words stabbed my heart like a knife. The night of the storm. A light that turns on and then off. Something was very, very wrong. I was sure of it now. 2 weeks passed and all my efforts were in vain. Not a single message, not a single call, not a single sign of life. I couldn't sleep. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, my mind a relentless tormentor imagining everything. Did Daniel have an accident? Was he kidnapped? Or did he just want to go somewhere to escape some unseen pressure? But no, Daniel would never leave Matthew. He was his whole world. And Matthew, my sweet grandson, where was he? The more I thought, the more I couldn't breathe, the air in my lungs turning to stone. I couldn't just stand by for another minute, another hour, another day. I decided to go to Daniel's house, and what I found there only made my anguish grow, a confirmation of a nightmare I had not yet fully dared to imagine. Now I'm sitting in the dim, sterile light of a hospital room, my hands gripping the edge of a cold plastic chair, as if letting go would make the whole world collapse around me. Matthew is lying in the bed, his small, frail body almost lost in the stark white sheets. A police officer carried him in his arms from that cold, silent house, and I, like a soulless shadow, ran after them, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. My hands trembled when I touched him, wanting to hold him to transfer my own warmth into his cold little body, but afraid to squeeze too tight, terrified I might hurt him, that he might shatter in my arms. Matthew didn't react. Not a blink, not a sigh. His little hands, even in unconsciousness, clutched the empty water bottle, as if it were the last thing anchoring him to this life. The patrol car sped through the dark city streets, the sound of the siren, a wail of despair that echoed in the lonely night. I sat next to Matthew, fanning his pale face with a piece of paper I had found in the house, while gently patting his back, a futile, desperate gesture of comfort. "Matthew, Grandma's here," I whispered, my voice a broken, ragged thing. But the boy remained like a living statue, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing, at a horror I couldn't see. I wondered what had happened to my grandson and to my son Daniel. That trashed, violated house, the empty water bottle, and the chilling noise from under the bed. It was all like a nightmare. I couldn't wake up from a waking horror. At the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed Matthew into the emergency room immediately. I stayed outside, my hands pressed against the cold glass of the door, watching them move quickly, efficiently around his small, still form. The sound of beeping machines mixed with the hurried, urgent voices of the doctors. No external injuries, severe malnutrition, severe dehydration, obvious signs of psychological trauma. Every word was like a stab to my heart. Psychological trauma. My 8-year-old grandson, that bright, joyful boy who always smiled like the morning sun, was now in there so thin, so fragile, like a dry autumn leaf that could blow away at any moment. A little later, a kind-faced doctor let me in. Matthew was already on an IV, a thin, transparent tube connected to his skinny, pale arm. His eyes were still open, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking at a distant, terrifying place, a place I couldn't reach, a place I prayed I would never have to understand. I took his cold little hand in mine and called his name, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Matthew, it's me, Grandma. Wake up. Please, sweetie, say something." But the boy didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I sat beside him on the edge of the bed, and the tears I had been holding back finally started to fall hot and silent. I remembered the days when Matthew was little, when he would run around my yard, his laughter echoing through the trees, asking me to tell him stories about when I was young back home. Now that infectious smile was gone, and in its place was a frightening, profound silence, as if my grandson had locked his soul away in a place no one could reach. The police also arrived at the hospital, their presence a stark reminder of the grim reality of our situation. They came with their notebooks and their gentle, probing questions. A young, serious-looking officer sat next to me. "Ma'am, could you tell us when you last had contact with Mr. Daniel?" I shook my head, a lump forming in my throat, making it difficult to speak. "It's been 2 weeks," I said, my voice a trembling whisper. "I called him. I sent him messages. I did everything I could think of, but nothing. Daniel would never do something like this. He always called me at least once a week without fail." The officer jotted down notes, his expression unreadable, nodding, and then turned to ask the doctor about Matthew's condition. They spoke in low, hushed voices. "The victim shows no life-threatening physical injuries, but he is in a state of severe post-traumatic shock." Hearing those words, I felt as if a heavy stone was crushing my chest. Post-traumatic shock. What did my sweet, innocent Matthew have to go through to end up like this? I wanted to demand answers, to scream, but the officer just took his notes and told me, "We're opening a missing person case. Could you come with us to the precinct to give a full statement?" I shook my head, almost begging, my voice pleading. "Let me stay with my grandson. I can't leave him alone right now." They nodded, their eyes filled with a compassionate concern, as if they too felt the dark, oppressive shadow that was now hanging over my family. That night I sat by the bed, a silent, helpless vigil, watching Matthew tremble as he slept in fits and starts. He clutched the empty water bottle tightly, even in his sleep, as if he were afraid someone would take it from him, his only source of comfort. Sweat ran down his forehead, soaking the pillow. Occasionally he would jolt awake, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it chilled me to the bone. But he wouldn't say anything. He would just look at me with that empty, vacant gaze. I wiped his forehead with a small, cool towel, my own hand trembling. "Grandma's here with you," I whispered over and over, even though I knew he couldn't hear me, that my words couldn't penetrate the wall of trauma he had built around himself. The doctor came to check on him, a middle-aged woman with a kind, weary look in her eyes. She put her hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Ma'am, the boy needs time. He went through a huge shock. Be patient. You'll see. He'll tell us what happened when he's ready." I nodded, a gesture of compliance, but inside I felt a terrible, frantic heaviness. Patience. How could I be patient when Daniel was still missing, when my sweet Matthew was here, a mere shadow of his former self? I spent the whole night sitting there, holding Matthew's small, cold hand, listening to his weak, shallow breathing. I remembered the last time I spoke to Daniel on the phone. His voice had sounded tired, but he still tried to laugh. "Mom, I'm fine. It's just that work has been a bit heavy." I didn't realize how heavy it was. I didn't ask more questions. Now I blame myself, a new sharp pain of guilt piercing through my grief. If I had paid more attention, if I had called sooner, would things be different? Would my son be safe? Would my grandson be whole? 2 days passed, and I didn't move from Matthew's bedside, as if taking my eyes off him for a single second would make him disappear into the ether. Matthew was still there, small and fragile, his thin hands now hugging a soft teddy bear a kind nurse had given him. I tried to feed him some warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, bringing it gently to his lips, hoping he would eat something, anything. "Eat, Matthew, sweetie, so you can get strong and go home with Grandma," I whispered, my voice trembling with a love that was almost painful in its intensity. But the boy barely swallowed a couple of spoonfuls, then clamped his mouth shut, his gaze fixed on the sterile white ceiling. Every night was the same. Matthew had terrible nightmares. Sometimes he would sit up suddenly in bed, his mouth open as if trying to scream, but no sound would come out, a silent, terrifying testament to the horror he had witnessed. I would hold him, rock him gently, and sing him the same lullaby I used to sing to Daniel when he was a baby. A soft, sad melody from a time before all this pain. But Matthew would just tremble, sweat drenching his forehead, his small body rigid with fear. I would wipe his brow, my hand shaking so much the washcloth would fall to the floor. I asked for a psychologist to come, a young woman with a very sweet, gentle voice. She sat next to Matthew, held his hand, and asked him quiet, non-threatening questions. Matthew, do you want to tell me something about your dad or about anything you saw? But the boy just hugged his teddy bear tighter, his eyes fixed on the floor without saying a single word. I stood to the side, my heart in my throat, a silent, desperate observer. Will he ever talk again, doctor? I asked, almost pleading. The psychologist looked at me with a deep compassion. Ma'am, he needs time. The shock was too great for a child. But I'm sure he will open up. It's just not the right time yet. I nodded, but inside I couldn't be calm. I didn't know how much time I had left to wait with Daniel still missing, and every passing day a fresh torture of anguish and pain. On the morning of the third day, I was cleaning Matthew's face, gently wiping a damp cloth over his thin, pale cheeks. I tried to smile a Herculean effort and started telling him an old story about Daniel, about when he was a boy, and broke one of my favorite vases and tried to tape it back together with Scotch tape. Your dad was so silly, Matthew, I said softly, my voice thick with nostalgia. But he loved you more than anything in the world. Matthew didn't respond, but I saw his little fingers squeeze the teddy bear as if he were clinging to something, to a memory. I was about to continue when the phone in my purse vibrated, a jarring sound in the quiet room. The caller ID showed the police precinct. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, panicked bird. A bad feeling, a cold premonition washed over me. I answered, my hand shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. The detective's voice on the other end was grave, very different from his usual calm, professional demeanor. Mrs. Helen, I need you to prepare yourself. We just used luminol to re-examine Mr. Daniel's house, and we found a very large amount of blood in the living room. My ears went numb, as if the world had suddenly gone silent, all sounds sucked into a vacuum. The washcloth in my hand fell to the floor with a soft, unnoticed thud. I couldn't feel my own hands. Blood, I repeated, my voice a strangled, broken whisper. The detective continued, and every word was like a knife twisting deeper into my heart. It's very likely we're dealing with a homicide. The crime scene has been cordoned off pending DNA results. I was barely processing what he was saying, not fully understanding the grim finality of his words. Then Matthew tugged hard on my sleeve. I turned and saw his red, tear-filled eyes, as if he had heard and understood everything. And then, after so many long, silent days, Matthew burst into tears, a heartbreaking, soul-shattering cry that shattered the calm of the hospital room. Dad, he's dead, he screamed, his voice weak, but full of an unbearable pain, as if his entire world had just collapsed. I fell back into the chair, hugging him with all my strength, as tears streamed down my own cheeks. No, Matthew, no, it's not like that. I told him the lie, bitter in my mouth, but I didn't even believe my own words. His few terrible words had been like a hammer blow to my heart. Matthew's desperate cries were heard over the phone, and the detective said quickly, Ma'am, calm down. We're on our way to the hospital right now to take an initial statement. Please don't move from there. I didn't answer. I just hugged Matthew tighter, letting my tears soak his thin hospital gown. The nurses and doctors rushed in, surely alerted by the heart-wrenching crying. A young nurse knelt down and put her hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Helen, stay calm. Let us take care of the boy. But I shook my head, holding Matthew even tighter, my only anchor, in a world that was spinning out of control. No, I have to be here with him, I said. My voice choked with sobs. I couldn't leave him. I couldn't leave him alone in this moment of unbearable grief, not after he had just spoken those horrible final words. The doctor checked Matthew and gave him a mild sedative to calm him down. He slowly stopped crying, but his eyes remained red, looking at me with a depth of pain I couldn't soothe. I stroked his hair, whispering, "Grandma's here, Matthew. I'm not going anywhere." But inside, I felt like I was falling into a dark, bottomless abyss. If Daniel was really, I couldn't dare to finish the thought. I remembered the last time I saw my son when he came to visit me in my town, bringing me a sweet corn cake that I loved so much. "Mom, take care of yourself, okay?" he had said, his face alight with that bright, beautiful smile. Now that smile felt like a distant, painful memory erased forever by the detective's grim words and Matthew's heartbreaking cries. An hour had passed since the detective's devastating call about the blood in Daniel's house, and now they were at the hospital with a recorder and a notebook, their presence a stark official confirmation of my worst fears. A young, tall, and slim police officer sat by the bed and said in a soft but careful voice, "Matthew, can you tell us and your grandma what happened?" I felt Matthew tremble in my arms, his thin little shoulders tensing up. He lowered his head, clutching the teddy bear in his hands, as if he were holding on to something to keep from sinking into the abyss of his memories. I stroked his hair and whispered, "It's okay, Matthew. Just tell us. Grandma is right here with you." I tried to make my voice sound calm, reassuring, but inside I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff about to fall. I was terrified of what he was going to say, but at the same time, I needed to know the truth no matter how painful it was. After a few long, agonizing minutes of silence, Matthew nodded slightly, a movement so small it broke my heart. I held my breath, squeezing his shoulder gently, and listened to each of his weak, broken words, as if each one was a shattered piece of his soul. That night, it was raining really hard. Matthew began his voice a trembling, almost inaudible whisper. I was playing with my Legos in my room, building a really tall tower that Dad said was the prettiest. And then the doorbell rang many times really loud. Matthew paused, looking down at his bear, squeezing it tighter, his small knuckles white. I got curious, and I went to see. Dad was at the door looking through the peephole, and his face was very tense. I'd never seen him like that before. Like a chill ran down my spine. Daniel was always so calm, so composed. He always knew how to hide his worries to protect Matthew. What on earth had scared him so much? Matthew continued, his voice getting quieter, a mere thread of sound. Dad turned around and he saw me standing there. He ran to me, knelt down and whispered, "Matthew, get under the bed quickly and don't come out until I call for you. You hear me?" I was so scared, but Dad pushed me toward my room in a hurry. I got under the bed, and Dad even pulled down the comforter to cover it so no one could see me. I pictured my little boy, only 8 years old, huddled under the bed in the cold, dusty darkness, not knowing what was happening, and I felt my heart ache with a pain so intense it was physical. Through a little gap in the comforter, Matthew continued, his voice now barely audible. I saw my mom come in with a very tall man. That man's face was very cold. He didn't say anything. He was just standing there with his arms crossed behind my mom. I was frozen. Jessica, Matthew's mom, Daniel's ex-wife. I never thought she would come back. Or rather, that she couldn't come back, not after everything that had happened, not after the restraining order. Matthew trembled, and his voice broke a small, wounded sound. "My mom, she looked all around the room and she asked, 'Where is Matthew?' I got so scared. I thought she was going to find me, but my dad told her in a calm voice. He went to his grandma's when the winter break started. I knew Dad was lying, but I didn't dare to move. I felt hot, silent tears roll down my cheeks. The police officer didn't stop writing, his expression serious, but I saw his hand pause for a brief moment when Matthew continued, his voice now a mere whisper. Then my mom, she started yelling at him. She was asking Dad for money. She said something about a debt, that Dad had to pay it if he didn't want trouble. But Dad just shook his head and said he wouldn't give her any money. He told her she had gone too far, that she had bothered him enough. Hearing that broke my soul. Daniel had tried so desperately to escape Jessica's toxic shadow. He had tried to build a new safe life for himself and for Matthew, but she had come back bringing a storm of trouble with her. Matthew stopped breathing heavily, as if the memory was dragging him back to that night of sheer terror. I rubbed his back gently and whispered, "Take it easy, sweetie. Grandma is here." The boy took a deep, shuddering breath and continued his words, a torrent of pain. "Dad, my mom and the tall man, they started fighting really bad. My mom was screaming, and the other man got closer, saying something like a threat. I didn't hear it clearly, but I saw him. I saw him push my dad. Dad stumbled back, and then he pushed him harder. Dad fell, and he hit his head on the corner of the table. There was a loud thud, and red water started coming out." Matthew trembled uncontrollably, hiding his face in my chest, and finally burst into tears, his small body racked with sobs. I saw Dad, lying there, not moving. I wanted to come out. I wanted to call him, but I was so scared. I was so scared. I hugged him with all my strength, my own tears soaking his hair, my heart shattering into a million pieces. The image of Daniel fallen of his life, ending so violently, replayed in my mind like a horrifying, endless nightmare. The police officer in front of me stopped writing and looked at me with a deep, profound compassion. "This statement is very important, Mrs. Helen," he said in a grave voice. "We are going to investigate this as a possible homicide. The boy has been incredibly brave." I nodded, but inside I felt an emptiness so vast that nothing could ever fill it. Matthew kept crying, his sobs like small, sharp knives in my heart. I looked at the officer and said with a choked voice, "Are you going to find her, Jessica, and that man?" He nodded firmly, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We will do everything possible, Mrs. Helen, I promise you." When the police left, I stayed there, hugging my grandson, feeling the cold, dark shadow of a tragedy that had just fallen upon my family, a tragedy from which we might never recover. That night, after the police left, I couldn't sleep a wink. Matthew's soft, intermittent sobs echoed in the quiet, sterile room like small, painful stabs to my heart. He moved his lips, calling for his dad in his dreams, in a voice so faint and broken I had to lean in close to hear him. Every time he did, I would gently wipe his tear-streaked face with a warm cloth, a futile attempt to soothe even just a little of the unimaginable pain he carried in his small heart. But as I touched his cold, clammy skin, old memories I had tried so hard to suppress came rushing back, hurting as if someone were pouring salt on a wound that had never truly healed. I remembered Daniel when he was young in his early 20s, his career just beginning, his eyes full of a bright, unshakable faith in the future. I remembered the immense pride with which he introduced me to Jessica, his face alight with a smile that shone like the summer sun. "Mom, this is Jessica," he had said, his voice full of a love that was almost palpable. "She's going to be my wife." Jessica back then had seemed like a good girl, a bit clumsy perhaps, but always trying to do things right. She would blush when I taught her how to cook my family's recipes, her eagerness to please so endearing. And I remembered thinking with a mother's hopeful heart, "Yes, this girl is good. She's going to make my Daniel happy." The whole family loved her, not just for her warm, infectious smile, but for the way she looked at Daniel as if he were her entire world, her sun, her moon, her stars. Then Matthew was born, and it was as if a new, brighter light had been lit in our family. I still remember the day I took him out for a walk in my yard, with Matthew nestled in my arms, his round, chubby face, his little eyes looking up at me with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. The neighbors would joke, "Mrs. Helen, you look 10 years younger." I would laugh, my heart so full of joy it felt like it would burst. Daniel and Jessica were still happy, then their love a tangible thing. They would visit me often, bringing Matthew and their stories of their new burgeoning life. I thought it would always be like this, that our small, happy family would always be full of laughter and light. But then, slowly, insidiously, everything started to fall apart. I remembered the day I got a call from Daniel. His voice sounded dull, tired, stripped of its usual vibrancy. "Mom, Jessica, she got into some gambling trouble." I froze the phone, feeling cold against my ear. I couldn't believe that sweet, good girl had fallen into something so dark, so destructive. The first time Daniel quietly sold the car, he loved so much the car he had saved for years, a symbol of his hard work and success, just to pay off his wife's mounting debts. I saw him sitting in the yard that evening, his eyes red and swollen, but he still tried to smile. Mom, I'll be fine. I just want to help her. I took his hand, wanting to say something to warn him, but I kept quiet because I understood that Daniel loved Jessica so much he was willing to do anything to save her to save their family. But things didn't stop there. The second time, when aggressive debt collectors came knocking on my door, making thinly veiled threats because Jessica couldn't pay, I had to take out all my savings. It was the money I had saved for my old age for a rainy day, but I didn't hesitate. I just wanted to protect my family and my son from the consequences of her actions. Mom, I'm so sorry, Daniel told me. That night, his voice choked with shame. I didn't think things would get to this point. I hugged him and told him not to worry, that family was for supporting each other through the hard times. But inside, I started to feel a creeping cold fear. Jessica was no longer the good girl she used to be. Every day that passed, she changed more, her light dimming, replaced by a restless, angry energy. Jessica became irritable, volatile, capable of breaking plates over the smallest, most insignificant thing. I remember one time I went to visit and I saw my sweet Matthew huddled in a corner, his eyes red and fearful because his mom had yelled at him just for spilling a glass of milk. Jessica was there screaming at him, her face contorted in a mask of rage. "You're just as clumsy as your father." I ran over and pulled Matthew away, trying to calm her down, but she just laughed a bitter, ugly sound. "He's my son. I know how to raise him." Those words were like a stab in my heart. Matthew didn't deserve to endure those terrifying fits of rage. I looked at Daniel, and I saw a man consumed by a quiet despair. His eyes that once shone with such life now only reflected a deep, weary exhaustion and a profound helplessness. Many nights Daniel would call me, his voice a torrent of pain and frustration. "Mom, I can't take it anymore," he would tell me, his voice trembling. "Jessica is not the woman I fell in love with. I'm afraid she'll hurt Matthew." Hearing him so broken, so defeated, shattered my soul, but I could only console him, offer him a safe harbor in the storm. "Son, if you need me, I'm here. I'll help you." Finally, after years of trying to save a marriage that was already dead, Daniel decided to divorce and fight for sole custody of Matthew. The day the judge made the ruling, I saw him sigh in relief, as if a massive crushing weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. I felt the same way. I thought that finally father and son would have a quiet, peaceful life, that Matthew would grow up surrounded by Daniel's unconditional love without any more shouting or heavy, suffocating debts. But I was so wrong. Barely half a year later, Jessica returned, and she brought with her a much worse, much more final nightmare. The story Matthew told me about that stormy night, about how Daniel fell and lay motionless on the floor, kept replaying in my head, a horrifying, endless loop. Jessica, the woman I once loved, like a daughter, the woman who was the mother of my only grandson, had become a stranger, a cruel, heartless person. Sitting in the oppressive darkness of the hospital room, I watched Matthew sleep, and I heard him sob, his lips still moving to call for his dad. In that moment, I made a silent, solemn promise to myself, to my son. "Daniel, I will get justice for you. I will protect Matthew no matter what it costs." The next morning, the sun streamed through the hospital window, a bright, cheerful light that felt like a cruel mockery. It couldn't take away the chill I felt deep inside, a coldness that had settled in my bones. I sat next to Matthew, watching him sleep soundly after the sedative. His small face looked calmer, but the mark of a profound, life-altering pain was still there, a shadow that might never be erased. The phone vibrated, a jarring sound in the quiet room. It was a call from the precinct. The detective, in a grave but firm voice, told me, "Mrs. Helen, we have new information. Could you come to the station right now?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and I whispered to a sleeping Matthew, "Grandma will be back in a little while. Be good. The nurse will take care of you." I entrusted my grandson to the young nurse whom I had gotten to know over these past few agonizing days, and I hurried out of the hospital, my mind a chaotic mess of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. On the way to the precinct, I was on the bus, looking out the window, but seeing nothing but the image of Daniel fallen of his life, being so cruelly extinguished as described in Matthew's heartbreaking story. I clutched my shawl in my hands, a futile attempt to hold back the tears that threatened to overwhelm me. When I entered the briefing room at the precinct, the lead detective, a middle-aged man with a sharp, piercing gaze, was already waiting for me. He spread a large map on the table and pointed to several red dots that were marked around Daniel's house. "We have a new lead," he said, his voice confident, professional. A neighbor's security camera recorded a suspicious truck on the night of the storm. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs as he played the video on a large screen. The image was blurry and shaky due to the poor quality of the camera, but I still clearly saw a dark truck parked in front of Daniel's house. Under the dim, flickering streetlight, I could make out the shape of something long, covered with a dark tarp in the back. Minutes later, this truck drove away, disappearing into the rainy night. The detective continued pointing to another video feed. "We can't see the license plates clearly, they're too blurry, but the model matches one that is frequently used by a local loan shark gang." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, a new wave of horror washing over me. Matthew's story came back to me, the part about Jessica, and the strange man wrapping Daniel in a blanket, dragging him out of the house. That long covered object in the truck. I didn't dare to think further, but the pain was like a sharp twisting knife in my heart. A young officer standing beside him added, his voice grim, "We've already checked the recordings from nearby traffic cameras. The truck appears at a couple of points, but then we lose its trail on the outskirts of the city. We're already coordinating with patrols to search for it." I nodded, but I felt my head spinning, the room tilting precariously. "Are you sure that truck has something to do with it?" I asked, my voice a trembling whisper. The detective looked at me, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "It's circumstantial evidence, but it's very important, Mrs. Helen. We're not going to let any lead go." I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, flickering thing, but at the same time, the fear of what they might find left me breathless, my lungs constricting. After the meeting, the detective suggested I go back with them to Daniel's house. I hesitated. I didn't want to face that place again, that house of horrors, but I knew I couldn't run away from the truth. When we arrived, the yellow police tape was still blocking the door, a stark, ugly reminder of the nightmare that had occurred within those walls. The forensics team was working inside, meticulously collecting samples, their movements precise and methodical, taking pictures of the scene. I stood on the porch, my gaze fixed on the dried coffee stain on the living room floor, where just a few days before I had entered and found everything destroyed, my world irrevocably shattered. That coffee stain, along with the scattered pieces of the broken cup, was like a scar that would never heal in my mind. Suddenly, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rose, approached, leaning heavily on her cane. She whispered to me, as if she were afraid someone would hear her, "Helen, on the night of the rain, I heard a very loud fight at Daniel's house, shouting, the sound of furniture moving. I I wanted to call the police, but I was scared, scared of getting into trouble." The woman lowered her head, her eyes full of a guilt that was heartbreaking to see. I took her hand and said with a choked voice, "Thank you for telling me. Can you tell the police now?" Mrs. Rose nodded, and I took her to the young officer. He wrote everything down carefully, thanked her, and promised to investigate further. I watched Mrs. Rose walk away, my heart heavy with a new complex grief. I blamed myself, wondering if I had arrived sooner, if I had acted on my initial fears, if things would have been different. Before we left, the detective gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder and said in a low, reassuring voice, "We're going to find that truck, Mrs. Helen. Have faith." I nodded, but inside, I didn't know if I had any strength left for hope. I left the house, the sun shining brightly, but my heart was cloudy, as if it were about to rain a storm of grief that threatened to consume me. A few days after hearing Matthew's terrible, soul-shattering story, I received a call from the precinct. The detective's voice sounded as grave as ever, but with a new hint of urgency. "Mrs. Helen, we found the address of the apartment complex where Jessica lived. Do you want to come with us?" I looked at Matthew, who was sitting on his hospital bed, hugging his teddy bear and staring out the window with a lost, vacant look. I didn't want to leave him, not even for a minute, but I knew I had to go. If there was any clue about Jessica about what had happened to my son Daniel, I had to see it with my own eyes. I'm on my way, I replied, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a desperate gnawing need for answers. I again entrusted Matthew to the young nurse, caressed his soft hair, and whispered, "Grandma won't be long, Matthew. Be good. I'll be right back." The boy nodded weakly, but his gaze remained empty, as if he were in a distant, unreachable place. The alley leading to Jessica's apartment complex was in a forgotten, neglected corner of the city where the peeling walls of the building smelled of dampness and car fumes. I walked alongside two police officers, my steps heavy on the muddy, uneven path. My heart was pounding not from exhaustion, but from the fear of what I was about to find. When we arrived, the building's landlady, a middle-aged woman with a sour, perpetually annoyed face, was sitting at the entrance, smoking a cigarette. As soon as she saw the police, she sighed in annoyance, as if she were used to these kinds of problems, as if trouble were a constant, unwelcome companion. "That Jessica," she said, her voice a dismissive, gravelly rasp. "She left about 2 weeks ago, handed in the key, and took off." Her words were like a physical blow to my chest. 2 weeks ago, exactly when Daniel had disappeared, exactly when his house became a scene of chaos and violence. I stood frozen, clutching my shawl to stay calm to keep myself from falling apart. The young police officer, the tall and slim one, asked, "When she left, was she carrying a lot of things?" The landlady nodded, putting out her cigarette in a grimy ashtray. "Yeah, a huge suitcase. She looked like she was in a real hurry, like she was running from something. Even hired some guy to drive her away in the middle of the night. Didn't say anything except to pay up." Just as we were about to leave, a strange man appeared at the end of the alley. He had a rough, intimidating appearance with a worn leather jacket and a face full of scars. He approached and asked the landlady in a hoarse, demanding voice, "Is Jessica still here? I need to see her. Urgently." The detective stopped him immediately, his look as cold as ice. "Who are you, and what's your business with Mrs. Jessica?" The man stuttered, clearly surprised and intimidated, and tried to back away, but the young officer held him firmly. After a moment of nervous hesitation, he sighed, his voice now laced with annoyance. "I'm Raoni. I'm her loan shark. Jessica owes me a lot of money. She swore she'd pay me back in 2 weeks, but now she's nowhere to be found." The police and I looked at each other, a silent, chilling understanding passing between us. No one said anything, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. The moment Jessica fled, the moment Daniel disappeared, and now the promise of a large sum of money. It all fit together in a terrifying, grotesque way. "Why would she be so sure she'd have a large amount of money in 2 weeks?" the young officer muttered, as if asking himself if she was so desperate before that she had to seek out her ex-husband. That question was like a knife in my heart. A bad, cold feeling grew inside me, cruel and suffocating, making me tremble. There was something darker, something more sinister behind all this, and I feared the truth was even more painful than I had already imagined. That night, I sat by Matthew's bed, the dim light from the hospital hallway casting long, eerie shadows on the wall. His sleeping face was illuminated, and he was still hugging his teddy bear as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. I took his small hand, feeling the faint, fragile warmth of his thin fingers, and I tried to calm the storm that was raging inside me. But then, like a flash of lightning in the dark, a vague, half-forgotten memory surfaced in my mind, making my heart race with a new, terrifying premonition. Many years ago, when Daniel and Jessica were still happy, Daniel had proudly showed me a life insurance policy he had just bought. "Mom, I want to protect my family." He had told me, his face alight with that radiant, beautiful smile. "If anything ever happens to me, Jessica and Matthew will have nothing to worry about." The sole beneficiary at that time was Jessica. And now, thinking about it, I realized with a sickening jolt that Daniel had never mentioned changing the beneficiary's name after they divorced. That memory was like a fresh stab in my heart. Could Jessica, with her huge crushing debt and her bottomless desperation, have set her sights on Daniel for the insurance money? I started to tremble, not from the cold, but from a horrible, suffocating premonition. I looked at Matthew. I saw him sob in his sleep, his lips moving to call for his dad. I couldn't stay still for another second. The next morning, I called the detective, my voice trembling with a new urgency. I remembered something. Daniel had a life insurance policy, and Jessica was the sole beneficiary. Can you investigate that? He was silent for a moment, and then he replied, his voice grim. Thank you, Mrs. Helen. That could be a key lead. We'll go to Mr. Daniel's house right now. I entrusted Matthew to the nurse again, asking her not to leave him alone, and I went with the police to Daniel's house. As we entered, the yellow tape was still on the door, a constant, ugly reminder of the nightmare. The forensics team had already left, leaving the house cold, silent, and empty. The detective took me and a young officer to Daniel's study, the room where he used to organize his papers, his life. They rummaged through the file cabinet, checking every single folder, while I stood there clutching my shawl, a knot of dread in my stomach. After more than an hour of searching, the young officer exclaimed, I found it! He held a blue folder, opened it, reviewed the contents, and passed it to the detective. He glanced over it, then lightly tapped the folder against the desk and said, with a contained righteous anger, Here it is, the motive. I looked at the paper and I saw Jessica's name printed clearly, starkly in the beneficiary section. My feeling, my horrible premonition was right. Daniel, out of a misplaced love and a sense of responsibility, had unwittingly left the path clear for Jessica to take advantage to commit the ultimate betrayal. I sank into a chair, hot tears streaming down my cheeks. Why didn't you change it, Daniel? I whispered, my voice choked with a grief so profound it was a physical pain. Why did you give her the chance? The detective placed a hand on my shoulder and said gravely, Mrs. Helen, if Daniel died in an accident, Jessica would receive all the insurance money. With that amount, she could pay off all her debts and live comfortably. This is likely the reason he disappeared. His words were like a hammer blow to my head. I clenched my fists, an immense burning rage growing in my chest. Jessica had become a monster willing to take Daniel's life for money. I remembered her face when she was young, when she smiled so happily next to my son, and I wondered, with a deep aching sadness, what had made her change so much. Ambition? Desperation? Or was she simply a person who had lost her soul? That afternoon, when I returned to the hospital, the phone rang again. It was the detective. His voice sounded more urgent than ever. Mrs. Helen, we've just received news from the investigation team. They found an abandoned frozen goods warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place the Loan Shark Gang uses for their illegal activities. We've already sent a special team there. I felt my heart pound like a war drum. What do you suspect? I asked, my voice a trembling whisper. He hesitated. We're not sure, but it's possible that we might find some clue about Mr. Daniel. I sat by Matthew's bed, my hands shaking so much I couldn't hold a glass of water. That night, when Matthew was already asleep, the phone rang once more. I answered, my hand shaking so much I almost dropped it. The police officer's voice on the other end was halting, as if he were choosing his words very carefully, trying to soften a blow he knew would be devastating. Mrs. Helen, we found a body, a man hidden in the frozen goods warehouse. We suspect it's Mr. Daniel. I collapsed, a lump in my throat, unable to say a word. My world, which had been teetering on the edge of a precipice, finally fell apart. Daniel, my son, the person I loved most in this world, was now just a body in a cold, dark warehouse. I wanted to scream, to rage, to tell them it wasn't true, but only silent, agonizing tears came out. Are you sure? I whispered, my voice broken. We need you to come and identify him. He replied, his voice full of a pity that felt like an insult. But please, prepare yourself. The next morning, I went with the police to the morgue, feeling a terrible soul-crushing fear clutching my heart. On the way, sitting in the back of the patrol car, I clutched my shawl and looked out the window, seeing nothing but Daniel's face, his smile, his laughter. I remembered the way he would tease me when I burned the sweet corn. Mom, if you ever open a bakery, I'll be your first customer. He would say, his voice cheerful, full of life. Now that vibrant smile was just a memory, and I was about to face a truth I didn't want to believe, a truth that would change my life forever. When the car stopped in front of the morgue, a cold, sterile building that seemed to suck all the warmth from the air I got out, feeling like I was walking in a dream, a nightmare from which I would never wake. The young police officer, the one who had been with me through these past few agonizing days, put a hand on my shoulder and said softly, Mrs. Helen, are you ready? I nodded a small, jerky movement, though inside I knew I would never be ready for this. The door to the cold room opened, and a frigid air smelling of chemicals and death hit my face, making me shiver uncontrollably. The white sheet covering the gurney was slowly, reverently pulled back, and then I saw Daniel's face. Although it was pale, although it was changed by time and death, I recognized my son instantly. His thick, dark eyebrows, his straight, noble nose, and the lips I'd kissed so many times when he was a baby. He was still my Daniel. I burst into tears, falling to my knees on the cold, hard floor, only able to say two words over and over. My son, my son. I wanted to touch him, to hold him one last time, to feel the warmth of his skin, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't lift them. The young police officer helped me up, his voice full of a sorrow that was both professional and deeply human. "We are so sorry, Mrs. Helen. Please sit here." But I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to do anything but scream at the world, at a God who would allow such a thing to happen. Why did my son have to be gone like this? When I had calmed down a little, the medical examiner, a middle-aged man with a grave, weary voice, approached. He held a folder and explained, his tone gentle but firm. The victim died from a severe traumatic brain injury caused by a strong blow against a hard object. The time of death is estimated to be the night of the storm 2 weeks ago. His words confirmed what Matthew had told me about that terrible, fateful night when Daniel fell and lay motionless on the floor. I nodded, but every word he said was like a fresh knife sinking deeper into my heart. "Thank you," I whispered, not quite sure why I was saying it. Maybe for the truth, as cruel as final as it was. The police didn't stop. They expanded their investigation, meticulously examining the truck that the security camera had recorded. The detective called me at noon, his voice full of a grim determination. "Mrs. Helen, we found a blanket stained with blood and a woman's jacket in the truck bed. The DNA results confirm the stain is Mr. Daniel's blood, and the jacket belongs to Jessica." I collapsed into a chair in the hospital hallway, my hands pressed against my chest, as if to hold my broken heart together. All the loose, jagged pieces now fit together, forming a picture of the crime so clear, so vivid, it was chilling. Jessica had really done it. She had taken Daniel's life. Using the statement from the loan shark they had found at the apartment complex, the police quickly arrested the unknown man who had accompanied Jessica that night. They invited me to the precinct to watch the interrogation from outside through a one-way mirror. The man with the rough, scarred appearance initially denied everything, grunting, "I don't know anything. I just went with her." But when the police showed him the evidence, Jessica's jacket and the blood-stained blanket found in the truck, his face turned pale, and he started to sweat profusely. The detective told him in a harsh, unyielding voice, "Do you think we don't know you helped her hide the body? Talk if you don't want your sentence to be worse." Finally, to get a deal, he confessed where Jessica was hiding an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, where she was hidden away like a rat in a sewer. I stood outside the interrogation room, clutching my shawl, feeling the world spin. Jessica, the woman who had once had dinner with my family, who had laughed with my sweet grandson, was now a fugitive, a murderer, carrying a heinous crime on her shoulders. I remembered the last time I saw her before she and Daniel divorced. She had looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "Stay out of it, Helen. This is between Daniel and me." I had tried to stop her, to tell her that Matthew needed his mother, but she had just laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. Now that laughter came back to my mind like a warning I had so foolishly ignored. A few days after identifying Daniel's body, I received the news that the police had finally arrested Jessica. They caught her in a small, grimy copy shop, trying to forge documents to flee the city. The detective called me, his voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Helen, we have her. Do you want to come to the precinct?" I hesitated, looking at Matthew, who was drawing on his hospital bed, still hugging his teddy bear, a small, solitary figure in a world of pain. "No," I replied, my voice choked. "I don't want to see her. Just, just make sure she doesn't escape." But in the end, as the police led a handcuffed Jessica down the hallway of the precinct, I watched from a distance, my heart a complex mixture of emotions. Seeing her, her face gaunt, her hair disheveled, her eyes empty. I felt a surge of anger, but deep down, a strange, unwelcome pity. Jessica, who was once my daughter-in-law, who was Matthew's mother, had destroyed her own life and the lives of the people she should have loved most. The trial took place in the city courthouse, attracting the attention of the press and the public. I sat in the front row holding Matthew's hand, tightly feeling his little hand tremble in mine. He didn't want to come, but I had gently convinced him. Matthew, we have to do this for your dad. Grandma will be right here with you. He had nodded, but his eyes were still full of a fear that no child should ever have to experience. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with a palpable tension like a rope about to snap. The prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp, incisive voice, stood up and presented the evidence, one damning piece after another. He played the recording of Matthew's statement, my grandson's small, trembling voice recounting the night of the storm. Hearing it again squeezed my heart, and I hugged Matthew tighter as he lowered his head, hiding his face in his bear. The prosecutor continued showing photos of the blood-stained blanket and Jessica's jacket found in the truck. The DNA results confirm that the blood belongs to the victim, Mr. Daniel. He said, his voice cold, dispassionate. He then projected the grainy images from the security camera, the blurry truck under the streetlight, carrying something long covered with a tarp. Finally, he held up the life insurance policy folder, pointing to Jessica's name as the beneficiary. This was the motive, he declared, his voice echoing in the silent, solemn room. The defendant planned a murder to collect the insurance money, pay off her debts, and live comfortably. I looked at Jessica sitting in the defendant's box, her head bowed. At first, she tried to remain calm, avoiding everyone's gaze, but as the evidence was presented, one irrefutable piece after another, she began to tremble. Suddenly, she jumped up and shouted, her voice a desperate, shrill sound. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted my money." Her voice broke, but no one in the room was moved by her pathetic, self-serving plea. The prosecutor approached and refuted her claim coldly. "If you only wanted money, why did you hide the body? You staged a fake accident scene and tried to collect on a life insurance policy." Jessica was speechless, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. She turned to her accomplice, the rough, scarred man who was with her that night, and screamed, "It was him, he pushed Daniel." The man immediately stood up, his face red with fury, and pointed at her. "You were the one who planned everything I just did, what you told me. You told me to push him to help you hide the body." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense, the murmurs of the crowd sounding like a rising wave. I hugged Matthew, feeling him tremble. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice small. "It was all my fault, wasn't it?" I stroked his hair, trying desperately not to cry. "It wasn't your fault, Matthew. Your mom made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and she's going to have to pay for it." But inside, I knew those words couldn't heal the deep, gaping wound in my grandson's soul. After hours of deliberation, the judge, a woman with a serious, unwavering gaze, stood to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and firm, leaving no room for doubt. The defendant, Jessica, is found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud, and is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The accomplice is found guilty of accessory to murder and concealment of a body, and is sentenced to 20 years in prison. When the sentence was read, I finally broke down, crying, hugging Matthew with all my strength. My tears were not only for the excruciating pain of losing my son Daniel, but also for the relief that justice finally had been served. Matthew hid his face in my chest, crying uncontrollably, his small body racked with sobs, and I could only rub his back, whispering over and over, "It's over, my boy, it's over. Your dad can finally rest in peace." A few weeks later, I decided to close up Daniel's house for good. I couldn't go back to that place, a place that was once filled with the joyous laughter of my son and grandson, and was now just a painful, haunting memory. I took Matthew to live with me in my small, quiet town. I enrolled him in therapy, hoping that the deep, jagged wounds in his heart would slowly one day begin to heal. Every night I sit by his side and I tell him stories about Daniel from when he was a boy, about how he always wanted me to be proud of him. "Your dad loved you so much, Matthew," I say, stroking his soft hair. "And Grandma does too." That night I sat by the window with a finally sleeping Matthew in my arms. The moonlight streamed in soft and gentle like a comforting hand. I looked up at the star-filled sky and I whispered, "My son, I promise you, I will raise and protect Matthew for you. Justice has been served." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but I felt a small, fragile bit of peace, as if Daniel were somewhere up there, smiling down at me. I hugged Matthew, knowing that although the pain of losing my son will never go away, I still have him and I will spend the rest of my life taking care of him, just as Daniel did. After everything we've been through, from the very bottom of my heart, I want to say to you, who have followed my story to this moment, that the love and care for family should never ever be taken for granted. A single oversight, a single moment of misplaced trust can lead to a tragedy with no turning back. Ambition and betrayal can turn your loved ones into strangers, but justice will always speak if you are persistent until the very end. I learned that true strength comes when you rise up to protect those you love, even in the midst of the deepest, most unbearable pain. And above all, this terrible loss taught me to value every single second we have together, because the love of family is the most valuable, most precious legacy we leave to the next generations. The story you have just heard has had names and places changed to protect the identities of those involved. I don't tell it to judge, but in the hope that someone somewhere will listen and stop to think about how many mothers, how many grandmothers are suffering in silence within their own homes. I truly wonder, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose silence to keep the peace? Or would you dare to face it all, to reclaim your own voice, to fight for justice? I would like to know your opinion, because every story, every shared experience can become a light that illuminates the path for others. God bless you all, and I am sure that courage in the end will lead us to better days.